Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Midi webinaire on geographic mobility and the intergenerational transmission of income in Quebec. This is a joint presentation from the six who have invited us all to be here with CRDCN and Cyrano. If you don't know me, my name's Grant Gibson. I'm the Assistant Director, Research and Evaluation for the CRDCN, which is the national organization partnership of universities that manage the RDC facilities on universities across Canada. And of course, we're good friends with the six who manage the RDCs and governmental data access in Quebec. And we're delighted to have two researchers with us today to present. We have Marie Connolly and Xavier Saint-Denis, both of whom are affiliated with Cyrano. Marie is a professor of economics at UQAM, and her research interests are mostly in labor economics. She's an empirical economist. She's interested in formation of human capital, gender wage gap, subjective well-being, labor force participation, and program evaluation. She's got publications in lots of great journals, and if you haven't heard of her, I'd be surprised, but you can follow her publications in the economic journals like Journal of Labor Economics and the Canadian Journal of Economics. Our other presenter is Xavier Saint-Denis. He's Assistant Professor of Population Studies at INRS and the Director of Social Statistics Study Group. His research focuses on social mobility, socioeconomic inequality, occupation and education trajectories, and social statistics. Before joining INRS, he was a postdoc at U of T, and he worked as a researcher at StatsCan. With his team, he uses a large number of administrative and linked databases made available to researchers by Statistics Canada. Just a quick note of housekeeping. If you have questions for either of our presenters, there's the chat function and the Q&A available for you. We'll read those out. Pour nos participants francophones, même si on est en anglais aujourd'hui, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si vous préférez. And without further ado, I will pass to Marie, and we'll hear from her.
Thank you, Grant, and welcome everyone. So we only have, 41 minutes now. So I will be brief in my introductions, and I will start sharing my screen. And do let me know if, for whatever reason, you don't see my presentation. So what we're going to talk today about is geographic mobility and the intergenerational transmission of income in Quebec. It's actually work that I've done with Xavier, who's here, and Yacine Boujija, who's a new hire for INRS. And you worked on this project while a PhD student at Université de Montréal. This work, you can find a report that's written for Cyrano. We will give you the links in the chat. There's a full report in French, and there's two short pieces, one in French, one in English, that summarize the key findings of the report. And in this report, what we do is we look at the role of geographic mobility in the intergenerational transmission of income, specifically for the province of Quebec. I need to acknowledge that, especially given that the webinar is organized by KIX and the CRDCN, that this work was conducted at KIX, which is also interesting for participants to know, in the sense that everything that we've done, you can do if you request access to the same data set that's available at the RDC. And we thank Cyrano for financial support for this work. So the context of this work is, in previous work, co-authors and myself had found a decrease in the intergenerational income mobility since the 1960s. Actually, I look at the date of the publication. This is the working paper version. The actual version is coming out just now in the Canadian Journal of Economics. In this context, what's an interesting question to ask once we've noticed a decrease in mobility since the 1960s is what factors underline the intergenerational reproduction of inequality, and what could explain, or at least account for, part of the decline that we've observed. And we're definitely not the first ones working in this area. Research is focused on childhood, adolescence, schooling. I put various references here on the screen. And generally speaking, we're interested in what kind of experiences young adults may have and life trajectories that might explain higher or lower intergenerational mobility or lack thereof. In what we're going to focus on in this particular study is the role of geography, and we found that that's particularly interesting because if you're familiar with some earlier work, let's say by Reich Chetty in 2014, that came out and described the landscape of economic opportunities across the US. And you might remember seeing heat maps where you see areas with more mobility, areas with less mobility. In those maps, the geography, the timing of when geography is measured is fixed, and it's during the teenage years. So typically, we will look at kids that are born and that lived in a certain area through their teenage years, and then we don't really care where they go in adulthood, if they stay in the same location or if they move, and we will assign whatever outcomes they have to the area, the geographical area of where these kids were growing up. There's a few exceptions. One is Chetty and Hendren in 2018, who look at the effect of moving from one location to the other. But in a lot of these type of work, the geography is static. Okay. There's also some work that looks at geographic mobility as an adult. And so in this longitudinal type of work, we're going to see studies that try to describe why individuals move, when they move, and the type of experiences that they have. But as far as we know, we haven't really seen work that combines the two or that looks at this longitudinal approach and its relationship with intergenerational mobility. So what we're going to do in this project, we're going to explore the role of geographic mobility in the dynamics of socioeconomic mobility in Quebec. And specifically here, we're going to look at intergenerational income transmission, or the degree to which one's income in adulthood is explained by the position of one's parents in the income distribution. And we're going to do three things. First, we're going to document the dynamics of migration. And here we're not talking about immigration or changing countries. We're going to look at internal migration. So whenever you see migration here, we're really talking about people who grew up in Quebec and move either within Quebec or outside of Quebec to another place in Canada, but we're not talking about international migration. And so we're going to document the dynamics of migration within Quebec among 16 to 30-year-olds. So we're going to start when individuals are age 16, and we're going to follow them until they're 30. And then we're going to present some statistic on intergenerational income mobility by migratory status and the type of region of origin. I have to say here, when we started this project, we had grand visions of being able to map everybody and where they grew up and where they're going, and have detailed pairs of, if I'm moving from location X and I'm going to city Y, what happens to me? It turns out, for disclosure reasons, some of those pairs that are not very common would be hard to get out of the RDC in terms of estimates. And so since this is sort of a first exploration, what we're doing when we're looking at region of origin, we're going to look at type of region of origin. So instead of looking at detailed pairs, we're going to simply classify the regions of Quebec as being either a metropolitan area, a small city, or a census agglomeration, or whatever else, which is going to be rural areas. And then the last objective is to we're going to use regression models, and we're going to determine the extent to which geographic mobility can explain intergenerational income transmission and the rural-urban wage differentials through the parental income distribution. And at some point, I'm going to let Xavier talk. And Xavier, please wave or express yourself if I'm going too slow. Okay, the data that we use, as I mentioned, they're data that they're available through the RDC. It's the Intergenerational Income Database, or IID. What they are is a set of linked T1s, so linked income tax returns, linked between parents and children. And we're going to be able to follow, once we've identified who's a parent of whom, we're then able to follow both parents as well as the child across years through their tax returns. And so we're able to measure income at different years. And we're also able to follow the individual through space, because we're going to use the annual geographic information that's derived from the postal code that's on the T1. We're going to look that geographical information is available for at age 16 for individuals that are born between 1967 and 1985. So those are people that we're going to look at. And we're going to define migration as a change of census division from one year to the next, except when you're moving within the same urban agglomeration. And we're going to specifically look at some point, I'm going to show you what happens by age, but later when we just say, are you a migrant or not a migrant, this is going to be between the age of 16 and 29. As I mentioned, what we do in terms of region of origin is we're going to classify those regions among three possibilities. One is you live in a Census Metropolitan Area. So those are large cities, more than 100,000 inhabitants at the time measured. So it could be a CMA, it could be a CA, Census Agglomeration. Those are smaller cities, so between 10,000 and 100,000 inhabitants. And everything else is classified as a rural area. To give you an idea, in Quebec, we have 6 CMAs: Montreal, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, Saguenay, Sherbrooke, and Gatineau, or the part, at least the Ottawa-Gatineau that's in Quebec. Examples of census agglomerations or smaller cities, you have Drummondville, Rimouski, Rouyn-Noranda, Granby. I think Drummondville in the last census acquired CMA status, but that's not the years that we're looking at. To give you an idea of the data that we have children. We have data on 2 generations, right? Children and their parents. And the children, which we're going to end up observing in adulthood, but those people are born between 1967 and 1985. Here we group them among groups of birth cohorts, just to be more concise. The number of observations, these are weighted observations, but unweighted, we're very close. This is not a sample. This is administrative data, so it's everybody that we can find. We have about a little bit more than 300,000 observations per group of bird cohorts. This is only for Quebec, as a reminder. And here you have the distribution of the type of region: CMA, CA, and rural area. The approach that we're going to use, what we're interested in intergenerational mobility. This is a typical type of model when we want to try to measure intergenerational mobility. There's different ways to measure it, but in this type of model, which we call a rank regression, what do is we try to explain child income rank, which is going to be that YIT variable. It's the income rank in percentiles. We're going to try to explain this by the parental income rank. So in this very basic model, you just have, it's a linear regression estimated by OLS. You have an intercept and a slope. That slope is going to be the mobility coefficient that we're going to be interested in. That slope, because here we're talking about ranks, that slope is also equal to the correlation between the parental and the child rank. One thing that's important to note here is what we mean when we mean income. When is income measured? And so for the child, we're going to look for the child generation. We're going to compute an average of total income when the child is aged 30 to 36. And for the parents, we're going to take the sum of the mom and dad, the total income, and we're going to average it when the child is aged between 15 and 19. There's some limitations to this type of approach. There's no, it's a descriptive exercise. There's no causal link that's identified. In this study, the rank is measured at the province level, so it may not take into account differences in the cost of living within the province of Quebec. And here, income is used as an indicator of socioeconomic position. So when we have this model, we use income because we have detailed and precise information on income for both the parents and the children over a large number of years for pretty much everybody that files a tax return, which is a lot of people. And we use this to measure socioeconomic mobility, but what we don't observe and what may be a better indicator of socioeconomic position is consumption, well-being, or a more general type of social status. Here we purely use income for that. So I'm going to show you, first I'm going to show you some descriptive statistics on migration, and then on intergenerational income transmission. And then I'm going to leave it to Xavier to talk to you about the models and what it means for the differences over time and what we observe between the kids that are born in 1967, the earlier cohorts, and the people that are more towards the end of our sample by the mid-1980s. So on this graph, what you see is everybody pulled together, and you have on the x-axis you have age, and on the y-axis the probability of first migration. And so what you see is that so we look at where you live at age 15, and then we see you again at age 16, 17, 19, and so on. And we try to see how many was the probability that you move from one year to the next. What we see is that this probability of moving steadily increases with age of the first move to peak at age 23 at just under 6% in terms of probability, and then it slowly declines. This is for the first migration. So first migration, and remember, this is not just I'm moving from one house to another house on the same block or even within the same city. This is really changing census division, so it's really changing region. So it's going from one city to the next, or from a rural area to another to a city. What we see is an increase in the probability of migration as one ages, and those migrations are in young adulthood are most likely linked with going to cégep or university, so post-secondary education, or moving for a job, especially a first job. This is by age. Then we're going to decline this also by different characteristics. The first is the type of did I go? No, okay, yeah. Sorry, the type of region of origin. And so the circles with the solid line, which is at the bottom of the screen, is the same graph we saw earlier, but specifically for those who at age 15 were living in a metropolitan area. The diamonds with the dash line are for those living in a census agglomeration, so a small city, small town. And the squares with the dotted line are for those living in a rural area. And what you see is that the probability of migrating is much lower for those who live in urban areas. And this is consistent with a story where if you move, you might move for opportunities like post-secondary education or a job, and those might be less available to you without moving if you don't live in a big city. So if you already live in Montreal, you have many choices of where to go to school. You can go to UQAM, you can go to Université Montréal. So you don't necessarily have to move to do that. You even have more than one choice. Whereas if you live in a more distant area, you might not have those opportunities next to you, and so you're more likely to move, much more likely to move, and to move also earlier. Sorry for moving this slide. Then what we do is we show you the same type of graph, but where we split the sample according not by the region of the type of region of origin, but by the parental income quartile. So we have information on parental income, and then we can rank those parents and split them into 4 equal groups: parental income quartile, and we can then observe what happens between those that are coming from a low parental income, the bottom 25%. Those are the circles with the solid line, up to those with the highest income. Those are the triangles with the solid dash line. And what you see is that those that are coming from lower parental income tend to move more early on at an earlier age. But those that are coming from a higher parental income background tend to move more at a later age. And so if I just look at the dots, so the people with the lowest parental income coming from the bottom income quartile, they at age 21, 22, 23 only reach about 5%. And those that are coming from the higher parental income tend to move more at a later age, which might be linked to moving for more opportunities. And then what we do is we put them all together. So we have by type of region of resident and parental income. Again, you see the same types of patterns. Those that move the most at later ages are coming from higher parental income quartile, and those that also move the most are those coming from the rural areas or the census agglomerations, not the census metropolitan areas. Once we have those facts down, you might also wonder how many times people move, because the graphs that I was showing you earlier were describing and showing the probability of your first move, not repeated moves or ever moving. And so what you can see here, if I look at the column all, where I put everybody together, we see that about 60% of our sample simply never move. And so 40% move at least once. But of those, about 20% move only once. And then another 10, 15 move twice. And then the rest move many times. Okay. And you can see the breakdown between rural areas and census agglomeration and CMAs. And it gives you an idea of the frequency of the various moves. Once we have that, what I'm gonna show you is estimates of rank mobility. And so remember the model where we were trying to get a handle on what intergenerational mobility, the strength of the intergenerational mobility. So we have this model where we explain child income rank by parental income rank. The slope coefficient that we find gives you the strength of the relationship, so the strength of the transmission between one generation and the next. And this slope is this rank coefficient that you're going to see here plotted on the y-axis. Now, the higher that coefficient, the higher the correlation between parental income rank and child income rank, the higher the transmission, and hence the lower the relative mobility. Okay, and that's something that's important to understand, because if you think that more mobility is a good thing, then because it means more equal opportunities, especially for children that are coming from lower socioeconomic background, then what you want to see is a lower number in terms of rank coefficient, because that number is sort of the inverse of mobility. Just to give you an idea too, to set maybe, if you're less familiar with this literature, to put things into perspective, coefficients around 0.2 to 0.25 is typically what we find in Canada. In the Scandinavian countries, we typically find numbers that are a little under that, so maybe more between the point, say 16 to 0.2. And in the US, we typically find something that's more around 0.34, 35, maybe going up to 0.4, 0.5, depending on exactly how we're measuring income and when we're measuring it in terms of the life cycle of the individual. That gives you an idea, so kind of sort of between the two. Okay, what we see here is what is that rank coefficient estimated for different individuals by their birth year, because we were interested in seeing the progression over time, and by the type of region of origin. And so what you see here, which I thought was really interesting, when I look at the line that is the solid line, the circles connected by the solid line, which is for the CMAs, you see that over time, so between the kids born in 1967 and 85, this is rather flat. I did not show confidence intervals. Those are typically estimated quite precisely. So the numbers for a given year are typically different, statistically different from one another. This is admin data. There's lots of observations. But you can see that this line is, if you were to look at over time, it's rather flat. And where there's the most action is for the other two. So if I look at people born in rural areas, born in 1967, at a mobility coefficient just over 0.2, and by the end of the period, they're above 0.25. So that's quite the large increase. And similarly for those born in smaller towns. And then this is my last slide before I turn it over to Xavier. I hope I give you enough time. The other thing that we see here is now we can also split what I showed you by whether you're a migrant, so whether you've moved between the age of 15 and 30 or 16 and 29 or not. And what you can see is that for the non-migrants from Census Metropolitan Areas, so the top graph, the solid line connecting the circles, or for all the migrants, regardless of the region of origin, typically the rank coefficients haven't changed much. And those that have seen the worst deterioration of outcomes in terms of the largest increase of the rank coefficient are those that were born in rural areas, especially and somewhat in smaller towns, and that did not migrate. So those that stayed in their region of origin, if that region was outside of the CMAs. Xavier, floor is yours.
All right, thank you. You should be able to see my screen now. For this final set of results, what we wanted to do is, take estimates from the same regressions that similar regressions that to those we've seen in the previous slides, but try to visualize and quantify the advantage associated with internal migration across the parental income distribution. So what we're doing here is, instead of plotting estimates of the row coefficient of the rank estimates that estimates the strength of the association between parental and child income, we're using predictions from the regression models to estimate the average income of individuals across the parental income distribution, depending on the region where they grew up and also whether they migrated or not. So all of these lines here show the average income of children who grew up in in families from the lowest to the highest income percentile. But then we see the gaps between the lines and gaps that can be of different sizes across the parental income distribution. So what this can tell us is, first, is there a gap in the incomes earned by children who, let's say, grew up in a CMA and did not move, which is the black plain line here, and children who grew up in a rural area or a CA and did not move. And so here we see that there's a gap. So non-movers are who grew up in a rural area or a CA are disadvantaged by a bit less than 5 percentile points relative to those who grew up in a CMA and did not move. Now, if we look at migrants, we see that there's an advantage in here, as Marie said already. So these are not causal results. So this is really descriptive. So we can't say that this is the effect of migration, but it's more an advantage, an income premium or advantage associated with migration. And so we can quantify the size of that advantage by looking at the gap between the plain line here, the plain line for the people who grew up in a CMA, and the long dash black line, which is people who grew up in a CMA and migrated. And so we see here that in that case, the advantage associated with migration seems to be fairly constant across the parental income distribution and fairly small. In comparison, if we look at the gap between the two other plain lines, solid lines, and the two dashed lines, corresponding dashed lines, we see fairly stable advantages associated with migration across the parental income distribution for that earlier birth cohort. But the gaps between the lines are larger. And so the advantages associated with the migration for people who grew up in a CA or a rural area in the oldest birth cohorts was larger than those who grew up in a CMA and migrated. Now we're going to look at the most recent birth cohort. And in this case, we're seeing that things changed quite a bit. First of all, we're seeing small or no gaps between individuals who grew up in CMA, CAs, or rural areas and did not migrate, and who were born in the highest income families. But we're still seeing a gap, and the gap did become larger among people who grew up in a CMA and those who grew up in a CA or a rural area and did not migrate. So there really seems to be a disadvantage, a persisting disadvantage in the 80s of growing up outside of a CMA. Now, when we look at the advantage associated with migration, we also see some changes. And so we see here that the advantage associated with migration seems to be even smaller for those who grew up in a CMA. And at the top of the parental income distribution, we also see a very small advantage associated with migration for those who grew up in high income families and grew up in a CA or a rural area. So the advantage is much smaller than what we were observing in the for cohorts born at the end of the 1960s. On the other hand, what we're seeing is a growing or at least stable, but maybe growing a little bit, advantage associated with migration for those who grew up at the bottom of the parental income distribution, so the least privileged children, and who were in rural areas or census agglomerations. And so we can conclude two things from these results. The first one is there seems to be if again, it's not causal, but if there were no migration, individuals who grew up in CAs or rural areas would be doing much worse overall than with migration, which seems to provide a channel for upwards income mobility. And we also see here that there seems to be this group of people which we could see as a group of people who may be left behind for different reasons and who seem to be faring significantly worse than other people who grew up at the bottom of the parental distribution, but also relative to the overall population. So I'm going to go very quickly on the rest of the results. They're just further details on the advantage associated with internal migration. So first of all, we disaggregated by destination. So looking at the advantage associated with migrating to a CMA, to another rural area, to a CA, or to an out-of-province destination. So we have a lot of results. I'm just going to quickly focus on the most recent birth cohort. And here, so the one born in 1982 to 85. So here we can see that the largest advantage for especially the group for which the migration advantage is the largest is really moving from a rural area to a CMA or an out-of-province destination. Same for individuals who grew up in a CA. Once we look at those who grew up in a CMA, there's a very small advantage associated with moving to another CMA and a penalty for moving to a rural area. And we also see the out-of-province migration advantage for this group. Finally, we visualized the same results, but slightly differently Here, this is just a different way to visualize the previous graph. What we were interested in doing is comparing individuals who moved to a CMA, for example, to those who grew up in a CMA and did not move. So comparing individuals by destination geography rather than the geography of origin. And the key finding here is that when we look at individuals who ended up moving to a CMA by the time they were in their 30s, they seem to be experiencing an advantage compared to those who grew up in a CMA and did not move, especially at the bottom of the parental income distribution. And so I'm looking at the first row here. And this was especially true for the birth cohorts born in the 1960s, but also true more recently for people who moved from a rural area to a CMA and a CA to a CMA. Relative to those who grew up in a CMA and stayed there. There may be, so again, I'm going to say it again, these are not causal results, but this helps us maybe understand a little bit more what may be driving some of the selection issues, some of the selection dynamics that drive those results. So almost all university campuses in Quebec are located in a CMA. So you've had the list previously. And so it's very possible that relative to non-movers, those who moved to a CMA did so to attend university and so are graduates from a university program and therefore experience an income advantage across the parental income distribution. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now and to give us some time for the question period. So what we found in this study was that geographic mobility seemed to be linked to the intergenerational transmission of income. And so geographic mobility seems to contribute to social mobility, but in ways that change over time. And importantly, we found differences in the probability of migration according to parental income and an advantage associated with geographic mobility. We've also found a decrease in social mobility, especially outside of CMAs and especially for non-migrants, and a related geographic mobility advantage, especially for those who grew up outside of CMAs and more recently at the bottom of the parental income distribution. So this leaves us with a few questions. The first one is, what's the source of disadvantage? So does it stem from a lack of opportunity within the post-secondary education system for the least privileged children who grew up outside of the cities where university campuses are located? Or is it something that may be related, which is exposure to greater risks of occupational instability, of precariousness due to the lack of economic diversification in rural areas, or the overall lack of well-paid job in regions outside of CMAs? And so these are kind of open questions we hope to explore further in future work. Our next steps for our analyses are to conduct Canada-level analysis and also to use data such as those from the data from the ELMLP to investigate the role of educational institution in the dynamics we're observing. So I'll conclude the talk here. If you have questions, you can write to us directly at those emails. Again, we thank Cyrano for funding the study, and I think we have a few minutes for questions if I'm not mistaken. Thank you.
We do. So our presenters do have to leave us at 1 o'clock, but if there are questions, okay, so Erin Strumpf from McGill, are the distributions of parental income or ranks fairly different across CMA, CA, and rural areas? She's curious how much the effect of migrating from a given area is confounded with family income levels, which was one of my questions, so 2 for 1.
Maybe I can get this one. So for the first part of the question, I'm not sure if we looked at this, but in the results that I presented, we let so you can see that the models let the advantage of migration vary by parental income and region of origin, and so the migration advantage is not the average migration advantage for individuals from a specific region across the parental income distribution. It really varies by parental income, and so that's how we were able to see that there's a larger migration advantage for children who grew up in the least privileged families in rural areas. But I'm not sure if it gets exactly to what you were asking. Maybe it's a part of it.
Yes, apparently. Good.
There was an earlier question that I answered in the chat asking about the role of education. And the short answer for this particular project is that we worked purely with T1 data, so we don't have information on education. I think it's definitely something that we want to investigate, and that is part of the mechanisms here. And we now have, either through, as Xavier mentioned, the ELMP, so the post-secondary
Education labor market linkage plot.
But the pieces, so the post-secondary, the registry of all post-secondary attendance, very detailed data that are available. But we also have the linkage between the census and the IID, the data we use in this project, which allows us, at least for a certain, not everybody because it's a long-form census, but we can retrieve some information on education, both for the parents and the children. So that might help tease out the part that's due to education, but we didn't have access to that for this project.
So there's another question is, what information do you have on income source?
Oh, very detailed. So that's the beauty of having the T1, is that you don't have much in terms of the scope of the data, but for what you have, which is income, you do have a lot of information. So we've used in this project total income, but you do have different types of income that are available that, sum up whatever sums up to your total income. Earnings, other types of employment income, investment income, capital gains, and benefits, various types of benefits.
So one of the other ways that you often see this kind of question answered is by looking at transition probabilities between different deciles. So, it's, in some cases, it's really nice to have one number. But did you do that analysis? And then if so, did you see anything interesting, or what patterns did you see?
No, we didn't do it. And I completely agree. When you do this, you retrieve a line, right? So you have two parameters, the intercept and the slope. And it's good in that it's concise, but it masks some of the variation, especially when you're looking at individuals who grew up at the very bottom of the parental income distribution, where it's less linear, so you're less close to that line. So for a huge chunk of the population, it's fairly good. But for those at the bottom, it is less so, which is why transition matrices might help in that respect.
So with that, I will thank everyone for coming today, and thank you to the presenters, my friends Marie and Xavier, and we'll let them get going. I'm sure they would be happy to take further questions by email, as they've alluded to. They're both very searchable on the web, and open to feedback. So thank you, everyone. Reminder that if you know somebody that missed this recording, it'll be available on the YouTube channel of the Six. Pascal's told me within the week, so you'll be able to share it, by next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
so
Grant.
much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.